Welcome back to Instagram versus reality, the segment on the channel where we call out bad Photoshop practices and impossible beauty standards with science or just basic common sense. As always, these videos are intended to be informative and are not aimed to target or slander anyone's brand. This week's submissions are from r/Instagram reality. We're going to start with a picture of actress Olivia Munn. Here you can see in this picture that there is no skin texture at all and her freckles are virtually gone. There are ways to remove freckles by the means of laser treatment, cryosurgery, chemical peels and natural remedies, but we know that she didn't have any of these procedures judging by her recent social media posts and public appearances. It's definitely likely that the editor removed her freckles along with the other little imperfections using an airbrush. To get this texture back, we're going to use the same technique that we've used in our previous videos, which is to add a new layer with 50% gray opacity, changing the blend mode to overlay or soft lighting, and then adding a texturizer filter, which is using sandstone to mimic human skin texture. Then we can adjust the scale according to the size of the pores, depending on the distance of the subject from the camera, and finally mask out the rest, or just invert the mask and paint in the texture where we need it most, which will remove it from the highlights by using the blend if slider. You can see the difference in the before and after, and now we can also add the freckles back in by using a custom brush, blurring it a little and lowering the opacity. This is the first thing that retouchers should keep in mind, that they do not get rid of any characteristic features like moles, freckles, any scars or birthmarks, as the final output tends to look like an entirely different person. Personally, I've been guilty of this in the past, but it depends on the image's final use. If it's for social media, where it's easy to compare old versus new, then it's a dead giveaway. If it's for a modeling editorial, then it's a different story. The second example is similar to the first one because the skin texture has been retouched into oblivion, but credit where credit is due, they have left the color untouched. As you can see, there are clear highlights, shadows and midtones throughout, but there's no texture at all. They have left some details like those two pimples and what looks like a mole, but that's not going to help since the skin is buttery smooth. It seems to be the most common type of retouching mistake made by almost everyone everywhere nowadays, and to be honest, it's making me miss those horribly done Liquify jobs from previous episodes. To fix the issue, we're going to again use the same technique of using a 50% grey layer, setting the blending mode to overall or soft light, adding the sandstone texture from the filter gallery, and then painting in the texture where it's needed. The final result is much more realistic, but there are blurry points that we simply cannot restore due to the resolution of the provided image. The third example is again the same kind. I have no idea how all of these pictures get posted because it's very clear in this picture that her skin is silky smooth. You also have a reference here because you can see that there is a lot of texture on her hand, but whereas on her face there is very little. There are also creases, pores and color variation, but in her face it's completely gone. She may have also altered her facial proportions such as the eyes or nose shape, but that's a lot more difficult to confirm without a previous photo. She has definitely had fillers applied to her lips, or to be more accurate, to her upper lip vermilion, since it's showing the beginnings of what's known as overfilling syndrome, where the lips become everted due to too much vermilion mass. The only redeeming quality about this retouching job is that the editor kept the moles near her lip, and judging by the amount of editing that has been done, it seems like he or she fought with all of his or her might to keep the mole untouched. Also, they've taken into account the colors and maintained the variation between the shadows, highlights and midtones, so that's a plus too. Now again, we're going to use the same technique used in our previous examples, and by using a 50% grey layer, adding a sandstone texture, and then masking in the parts we need, we can finally remove it from the highlights using the blend if slider. I've shown you 3 examples of the same technique to emphasize its versatility in adding texture specifically to human skin. In our next example, there are 2 things missing, texture and color variation. In her defense, she could be that pale naturally, but even in pale-skinned people, there's a lot of color variation as we've mentioned in our previous video. That's because there's a lot of things going on in our faces, like the temperature, and that causes warmer tints of reddish or orange, and colder tints of cool bluish shades. Here, none of those things are present. The only thing that is there is the highlight on her nose. You can tell that this picture is retouched because she or her editor has retouched her eyebrows too, and that has resulted in the eyebrows becoming much more lighter than originally intended. Here, they're almost translucent, and that's obviously not natural. So to fix this, we can just use a new layer with a soft light blending mode and paint with a darker color, or we can use a curves adjustment layer and bring the midpoint down. Then you can use an inverted mask and paint in the shadows on her face. Similarly for the highlights, we can bring the midtones up and paint the highlights in. For the color variation, we can use a color balance adjustment layer and increase the reds in the highlights and midtones because those are the ones that are really lacking on this face. Then you can bring the opacity down and you can see that it's a bit less lifeless than the original. For the texture, we can use the same technique, but here I don't think it's really necessary because it's a low quality JPEG and it's not a close-up shot, so you wouldn't really be able to see much of the texture anyway. This photo can never be realistic because of her warped facial proportions, so it doesn't really matter. This next example marks the return of our channel's favorite family, the Kardashians, and this time we're talking about Kris Jenner and Gordon Ramsay. Clearly this picture has been heavily edited, and I remember vaguely at the time it was news of the tabloids as Gordon Ramsay posted an unedited version and Kris posted a touched up one. Here they did leave the forehead lines to be generous, but the rest of the face just looks like a Madame Tussauds wax sculpture. In case of Kris's better retouched example, you can see the creases and the texture. They have only removed the blemishes and fixed the color inconsistencies, which you can see here. It's amazing how these things get overlooked by the teams of photo editors and social media managers that these celebrities have. For non-celebrities, it makes sense because they don't have an army of employees working for them to prevent such things from happening, but in the case of celebrities, it's not necessarily negligence, but rather inexperience in knowing what to look for. Moving on, here there's virtually no texture whatsoever. Again, they've kept the forehead lines, but that is not enough. These lines are iconic in their own right and should be kept in, but there should also be skin texture. To create the texture from scratch, we're going to again use the same technique of using a 50% grey layer, applying the same sandstone texture, and then inverting the mask and painting it where it's needed. Also, we need to keep in mind that the scale of the texture, as you can see here, is too large for this picture, so I'm going to bring the scale down just a little bit. Since this picture is of a low quality and way too smooth, it's not going to be enough. What we can do to make it look more believable is sharpen the picture only in the face area by using the high pass filter and using a smaller radius of less than 1 pixel. Then using linear light, hard light or overlay, we can blend the two layers together to only emphasize the midtones. It still looks a bit off because there's not a lot of information in this picture, and that's why professional editors prefer to work with raw image formats because those are much more superior than your regular JPEG. We're trying to do the best we can with what we're provided, but this leaves room for a lot more adjustments that we can do without losing any quality or it looking fake. This next picture reminds me of, well, this. What's surprising is that it's actually pointing towards his teeth, so maybe he actually did have his teeth widened and it ended up being too much for him. Then again, you can see that this picture is retouched because there's no skin texture at all. Using a reference point, you can see the differences between his chest and his face. To accurately match the lighting on his teeth with the rest of the image, we can use what's known as a check layer. A check layer or a proof layer is one that helps in visualizing areas of imperfection that you might have otherwise missed when looking at your image with the naked eye. You can see that his teeth are as bright as the clouds in the background, and that obviously should not be the case because his teeth are being illuminated by the sky and are not magically producing their own light. To bring the brightness down, we can just use a level or a curves adjustment layer and bring the white point down and mask out the parts that we don't need. For the skin texture, we can use the same old technique of using a sandstone filter on top and masking in the parts where we need it and removing it from the highlights using the blend if slider. This next example is a bit strange, but it's not as bad as the others. It's just a simple misuse of the Liquify tool. Here he's used one of the many tools in the Liquify toolbox, the pucker tool, which makes things smaller, and went a bit overboard with it when using it on his belly. As the pucker tool shrinks pixels towards its center, it creates a very noticeable pincushion distortion, which is what we're seeing with these shorts. To fix it, we can simply use the opposite of the pucker tool, which is the bloat tool, and as the name implies, it blows pixels up to proportion. Our next example is from a store that sells artificial nails, and they've applied the diamond texture onto the nails without any shading, and that just makes it look obviously fake. To prove that, we're going to be using a different check layer, which is a threshold adjustment layer, where you can find the darkest and lightest points of your picture. Here, as you go from the black to the white point, the first thing that shows up in white are the nails, and that shouldn't be because the surroundings should be much brighter than the nails themselves. We can use a curves or adjustment layer to bring the white point down, and if this point shows up at the same time as the nails or the rest of the photo, then we know we're close to getting a good match. Then we can add 2 more curve adjustment layers to darken one side up and brighten the other side. Finally, we can add a little shadow under the nails to make it look like the nails are actually there, and it's not just a texture slapped on top of the nails. We're going to end this video with the double thumbs of Khloe Kardashian. We're only focused on the thumb in this example since it's sticking out like, well, a sore thumb, and the rest of the picture is edited very well actually. As she has 2 thumbs on her left hand, it could have been due to the clone stamp tool, which makes a copy of a selected region, or it's a feature of double exposure photography where sudden movements during the shot can create a ghost image. I wouldn't know what they were clone stamping there, as there is no need to use it on your fingers, but we can simply fix this by duplicating the thumb onto a new layer and removing it using the content aware fill tool so that we have more background to work with. Using the clone stamp tool to fix the seams or the crease that she has in the middle of her finger and shaping the nail to look like an actual nail, we can get a very passable photo for Instagram. To make the thumb fit her slender hands, we can use the clone stamp tool or the Liquify tool to manipulate the background as you see fit. So that brings this episode to a close. Hopefully you've learned something about Photoshop and why most things on Instagram are just edited. We've covered everything here in a previous video somewhere along in the series, and I really recommend following our Instagram page as the before and afters of the photos from this series and many more are posted there with an in-depth explanation. As always, if you're enjoying the content, you can support the channel by subscribing and click the notification bell to catch future episodes.